Nothing to see here, folks, just Firouzja smashing up another Super GM in less than 40 moves, as he does so often. This time it was Sergey Karjakin in the firing line, and this was played in 2020 in the online Cup of Nations. So Firouzja goes for his Karo Khan, which he loves to play. He has great success with this opening. Firouzja has black here, and a big thanks to Easy Knit and Durant for bringing this game to my attention. It was mentioned on chat after the game I showed yesterday, in which he smashed up Karjakin there. So we had this advanced variation, pawn to e5. Firouzja goes bishop to f5. You want to get that bishop outside the pawn chain. Knight to f3. And we'll see that Firouzja later pins this knight, spends an extra tempo, but he couldn't have gone to g4 immediately because the knight hadn't yet developed. Pawn to e6 now, bishop to e2, knight to e7. Might look strange blocking this dark squared bishop, but we'll see that that bishop soon gets opened up. So knight b to d2 now. Sergey's bringing this knight into here, so that after pawn to c5 captures, after the knight comes into c6, then we see this knight come into b3. It holds this pawn, prevents the immediate recapture, but okay, Firouzja will win back one of these pawns, either e-pawn or c-pawn. So now bishop to g4, this is what I was mentioning. He spends that tempo, he wants to eliminate this knight if he can. Castles came first, now knight to d7 hitting both of these pawns, and Sergey decides he wants to keep that knight on the board. He goes knight to e1 here, so the bishops come off, the queen recaptures, and after this captures on c5, Firouzja could have taken this pawn there, by the way, but he goes for the c-pawn. We have this one, bishop recaptures, and now that knight comes into d3. So this was Sergey's idea. So the bishop drops back, and what we can see out of the opening here is that Sergey is a little bit better. He has the space advantage with this cramping pawn, and he gets some pressure going on the king side now with queen to g4. You see this move very often in the French as well, and this structure is very much reminiscent of a French pawn structure now, but the bishops are gone. There's no bad light squared bishop behind the pawns. So you don't want to castle here. You're running straight into bishop h6, threatening checkmate. Only way to defend is this, and you're losing the exchange. So after queen to g4, Firouzja instead played king to f8. He's never afraid not to castle his king. It's so much fun to watch. Now we had queen to h5, and this move was slightly strange to my eye. It overprotects this pawn here. Maybe you're preparing to pressure on f7 later if you break with the f-pawn, but I'm surprised Sergey didn't start with bishop to e3. So we had king to g8 now from Alireza. He comes off that f-file, prophylaxis, and we had bishop e3 now from Sergey. So there are options here for Firouzja. He could have played pawn to d4, but then the bishop drops back. And I think what Sergey is arguing here is that after a line like this, say queen d5, queen e2 holding this pawn, rook c8, rook fd1, that this pawn is actually going to be more of a weakness for black than an asset, because of the fact that this pawn hasn't yet committed to c3, so white has the options here for when to rip open the position. So Firouzja didn't want to go in for this. He didn't want to be stuck passively defending a d-pawn. So he goes rook c8. Now we had rook a d1. The queen came to a5, hitting this pawn. a3 was played. Queen a4 probes here. And we had pawn to c3 now. And the other nice thing about queen to c4 is we'll see how Firouzja's heavy pieces now use this fourth rank to pivot really nicely in this game. So pawn to a5 played, starting this minority attack on the queen side. And now I don't like the next move from Sergey. I think he should be going something like pawn to f4 here. Get the counterplay going on the king side. Firouzja's trying to come on the queen side or through the centre soon. But by going with this counterplay, you give black something to think about, and you also keep this bishop here, keeping an eye on the d4 break. With how Sergey played bishop to g5, he just helps Firouzja unravel here. So pawn h6 played, the bishops came off, the knight recaptured, and now this knight is heading for this wonderful f5 square, and you really can't stop it. If you try an ugly move like pawn to g4, then this rook comes up here, using this pivot square along the fourth rank. Say you go f4 to block that attack, well, pawn to d4 is really powerful. Black's better in this position. I won't go into all the lines, but if you start pushing pawn f5 here, then we take, and the rook's coming across to capture here, we check. The queen can always come into e4, hitting this diagonal. Actually, black is attacking, not white. So Sergey understands this. He went pawn to h3 here instead. He lets the knight hit f5. He now goes rook f to e1, but rook c4 comes, and pawn to g3, covering this h4 square. And we can see that it's black now that's taking the initiative over from white. White has no active pawn breaks. Black has all the play in the position. So queen to c6 was now played. Queen f3 covers these light squares. Now if d4 comes, at least you can get the queens off the board. Pawn to h5 played, securing that knight, and also starting the process of trying to open up this rook, get it into the game. Knight to f4 now from Sergey. He hits this pawn. Now you don't want to kick on too soon here. For one thing, you let white close the position. There's also a tactic here of taking this pawn. After recaptures, you drop the knight. So Firouzja understands this. Don't rush the position. You're better. Instead, play pawn to g6. Just hold that h-pawn. So rook d2 now from Sergey. And what we'll see is that he can only really shuffle along these back three ranks. Pawn to b5, knight d3 covers this b4 break, but now Firouzja switches tactic. Pawn to g5. The knight left that square, so it can no longer take here, so bang, Firouzja pounces, he's going for that attack on the king side. Now you can't actually shut down the attack here with white. There's a big threat to go pawn to g4, hitting the queen, hitting this pawn, ripping open the position, and so that's why Sergey drops back the queen. Now if you push pawn to g4, the plan is to close the position. Same if you go h4, close the position. So you don't want to give white that opportunity. So instead king f8 was played. Some prophylaxis here, preparing the attack. And the other thing is you've got d4 in the air that white has to keep thinking about. So king h2 played, king to e7, queen to h1 now. Rook to d8, and this is a beautiful switch because Firouzja realises he can't yet push one of these pawns yet, or white will close the position, so he turns his attention to his other asset, which is this d5 pawn, breaking to d4. Rook e to d1 was played, rook to e4. I love how the heavy pieces just pivot on these light squares in this game. Queen to g2 now, queen to c4, king to g1, and now Firouzja switches back. Rook to g8 here, coming back to that king side. He loves to attack the king. He delays pushing any kind of d4. Not that you could there because your rook is hanging. So queen to h1 now played, rook to g6, queen back to g2. Sergey's really shuffling here as we can see. And now if you want to pause to see how Firouzja proceeded, then please do so. So there are many moves here, but Firouzja plays knight into h4. Awesome stuff, always going for the throat. If you take this knight, then obviously we recapture here. You open up this line, you're picking up the queen. So Sergey drops the queen back here, and now pawn to g4 came, again giving that knight on the edge of the board. And this time it was taken because everything is just blowing open the position. So captures here was played. Firouzja took the pawn here with check. The king sidestepped, and pawn h2 was actually the final move of the game. Sergey resigned here in the face of an overwhelming attack. So if he takes that pawn, then rook comes on h4. The queen is trapped, you're losing the game. And if you leave the pawn where it is, say try pawn to f3, well then we just jump down like this, and we're winning the queen once again. If you enjoyed this game, then click here to watch a stunning Benko Gambit game between Firouzja and Nakamura. Thanks for watching and see you soon.